Welcome to the Rare Earth Exchanges podcast, where power, politics, and the world's most coveted materials collide. Rare earth elements power the backbone of tomorrow's most critical technologies. With China dominating global production, the U.S. and its allies must align strategically to ensure a stable future. This urgency prompted tech entrepreneurs Daniel O'Connor and Dustin Olsen to launch Rare Earth Exchanges, a news and insight platform built to equip stakeholders and decision makers with the tools and intelligence needed to reduce dependency and build prosperous resilience. Let's get into it.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Rare Earth Exchanges podcast. We are thrilled to have you back yet again. I'm Dustin, joined by my co-host Daniel, and today our guest is Farhad, who is the CEO of Millennial Potash. Potash, right?
Potash. Yeah, that's correct.
Yep, Potash. Yeah, I've heard it pronounced many different ways. So for our listeners, potash is in the critical mineral space, which is a little different from the rare earth elements that we typically talk about. But Farhad is deeply involved in this. You've worked in the resource space for pretty much your whole career. So we're excited to kind of dive in and learn how this is valuable and where it's important in the market. So Farhad, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Hi, Dustin. Hi, Daniel. No, great to be here. And I'm glad that we started with education already. So we're going to teach people how to pronounce potash. So by the end of the podcast, they'll know exactly how to pronounce it. But that also tells you how little it is known, right? So if people can't really pronounce the name itself, let alone, what it is used for. No, thanks a lot, guys. Thank you for inviting me to this show. Maybe we'll start with what potash is. So potash, or the official name is potassium. In some other languages like German, it's Kali. So that's why you have KCl, so K standing for Kali. So look, it's basically used for chloride, for fertilizer. So KCl, chloride of potassium, it is a kind of salt that forms in the crust of the earth, as many other minerals, and it is used for other things as well. Probably like 1 or 2% of potash worldwide is used in ceramics and so forth, but most of it is used as fertilizer. It's key fertilizer, and it has been one of the most important fertilizers in the last several decades. And has become a critical mineral. Canada started it. Canada put it on its critical minerals list first, and as you probably know, last year the U.S. did the exact same thing.
Very fascinating. So as I was saying a little bit earlier, going in more to your background, so you've successfully built and exited multiple mining companies across potash, lithium, uranium. So the question is, what patterns have you learned about what makes a resource investable?
Yeah, Dustin, our approach is, I would say, I will try to simplify it, but it's top-down approach. First, we'll look at major trends that will affect certain commodities. Whatever major events could be. For example, in the case of lithium in the past, we looked at what's happening with electric vehicles, storage facilities and so forth, and how it will affect supply and demand. The same thing we did with uranium and, of course, with potash as well. So that's step number one. So once we have a specific macro view on the commodity, again, depending on the supply-demand situation and dynamic, we zero in on a specific commodity. And then we start looking for a project in an acceptable jurisdiction. So I would say there are 3 parts to our analysis or to our approach. One is macro view, which involves quite detailed supply-demand dynamic analysis going forward 3 to 5 years at least. And the second one is, project analysis or project due diligence. And the third one, which is almost as important, if not more important than the project itself, is a jurisdiction. In other words, what country it is in, what kind of operating environment we're facing, what kind of permitting, situation there is, whether we can actually bring in foreign direct investment to that country and so forth. And of course, the core of all this is the project itself. So we do diligence on the project. We'll look at geology, we'll look at its location, we'll look at the infrastructure and logistics. And we'll look at a lot of projects that, I would say on a weekly basis. And we have very strict criteria. That's why we do 1 or 2 projects at a time, because it's very difficult to hit all these check boxes. But that's how we come down to one specific project, and we take over that project. And then we take it from very early stage all the way to the point where it's shovel ready, meaning they're ready to go into construction. Sometimes we'll build these projects and start production, but in many cases we actually bring it to a certain point, and then we sell it to larger mining companies that can actually develop them a lot better than we can.
So I had a question about potash, the market, and mining and processing. It's very different, this critical mineral, than some of the rare earth elements. It's a little bit more diversified. where it's being mined. And can you talk a little bit about that? What are some of the dynamics in the market? What are some of the factors prompting your efforts for the company at a macro level? And then we could drill in more on that.
That's a great question, Daniel. I'm glad you asked it because it is a very unique sector that straddles both mining and agriculture. Because obviously, you mine the product, but it is used for agriculture for many crops, obviously worldwide. And
Right.
what is unique about it is also its structure, meaning the supply is quite limited to probably a half a dozen countries, believe it or not. So it's geographically highly concentrated. Almost 70% of it comes from Canada, Russia, and Belarus. Then we have a little bit of production coming out of other places, such as Germany and Middle East. It's mostly Israel and Jordan. China is a substantial producer of potash domestically, but they import a lot more as well. So it is a very interesting situation where half a dozen countries and about a dozen companies produce potash, and the rest of the world imports and uses of potash. So if you look at the demand side, it's also a very interesting situation. Obviously, the largest agricultural countries are largest users of potash, but almost all of them are importers of potash, meaning that they have very little domestic production. So that's where it creates, we have a very unique situation where we can actually take advantage of that. And I'll explain in a second why. So if you look at major ag countries, and this would be China, of course, because of its population, India, Brazil, the U.S., and West Europe as a region, you will see that, U.S. is almost exclusively imports its potash. Most of it comes from Canada, but until recently, well, not only until recently, let's put it this way, even in 2025, despite all of the geopolitical tensions with Russia, the U.S. still imported about 1 million tons of potash from Russia, believe it or not. So in other words, it's that critical. Despite all the animosities and so forth, the U.S. still imported from Russia. Now, if you look at Brazil, the largest importer of potash, 13 million tons a year, they import almost all of it. Now, India, zero domestic production as well. Everything is imported. China, as I mentioned, has a substantial domestic production, but they still import almost 10 million tons. So think about that, all these countries, and of course everyone else too, I'm just talking about the largest ones, largest users of potash, are almost completely dependent on those countries, meaning Russia, Belarus, Canada, and 3-4 other countries who actually produce a lot less than those three. So that is the situation that has been going on for decades. And one thing that I want to mention here, which obviously I hope that our listeners and viewers will find it interesting, even despite all these, again, geopolitical tensions between the West and Russia/Belarus, Canadian and Russian and Belarusian producers do not actually bring the potash price down. In other words, the Canadians go and sell it on an annual contract basis to China and India, for example. Right on the heels of them, the Russians and Belarusians come there and sell the same. So they could have easily undersold them, undercut the price, but they don't do it. So they still maintain quite a bit of discipline in the market, hence in the price of potash. So that brings us to a situation where a lot of these users would like to see diversification of supply. They would like to see potash coming from new, what I would say, geopolitically neutral jurisdictions. So I would say that is a very unique situation in potash sector.
Well, a question on that. This is fascinating. So there's a handful of big producers, and they're very different. Russia, Canada, Belarus. I guess Belarus has some ties to Russia. Is there any kind of questionable pricing going on, or is it, OPEC type stuff, or is it just like, how dynamic is the market? Is it just because there's so few producers that the price is somewhat inelastic? Like, what's the economic?
Well, that's yeah. So Dan, you hit the nail on the head. So here we have a very unique situation where Canadians, and when I say Canadians, they're basically two major producers out of Canada. Both of them are listed in New York and in Toronto. So Nutrien and Mosaic. Within North America, they sell their potash separately, potash and other fertilizers. In other words, that's two distinct companies. But outside of Canada, they sell through an organization called Canpotex, which is an overseas marketing arm for Canadian potash producers. So in other words, outside of Canada, they sell as one group. So you can imagine that they obviously maintain the price as far as they're concerned. Russians and Belarusians used to have exact same situation until about, I think, 2013, 2014. And then they had a spat and that cartel or oligopoly fell apart. Having said that, despite that, the Russians and Belarusians still operate, I wouldn't say as one unit, but they coordinate. I'm not sure about pricing, so we don't have obviously any facts to talk about it. But when you look at the way they operate, and also bear in mind that today, at least since 2022, since the Ukrainian war started, Belarusian potash is almost exclusively transported through the Russian territory. So you can imagine that obviously there will be a lot more collaboration because of that as well. So those are definitely significant factors. I don't want to call them oligopolies, but there's definitely coordination among players.
Yeah, it's not quite that, but I see what you're saying. It's suppliers that have interests that it's not necessarily orchestrated. It's just sort of naturally aligned in some ways.
Exactly.
And more dynamism is needed in the marketplace. And that's
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
we do see the price disruptions, believe it or not, in both directions. To give you the most recent examples, again, during COVID, when the supply chain the supply chains across the economy, because different sectors actually have been disrupted. Potash was not an exception. So we saw this spike in potash price, which was very unusual. It spiked from $300 to about $900 per ton, came back to normal average price now, historical average. And in the opposite direction, the same. But as I mentioned, when the Russians and Belarusians fell out, the price of potash came down as well. So those things happen, but generally speaking, it has been a very disciplined market as far as suppliers are concerned.
And a quick question just on the processing or refining. How much goes on in that business versus, it's pretty much the geological product that you're pulling out is the product, basically. I mean, how much refining happens with potash?
I suspect, Daniel, you're asking that question because you're quite well familiar with rare earths, where there's a possibility of mining in one end or one location and processing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it's a little bit different in potash, whereas basically both the mining, meaning extraction and processing, happens in the same location. So it doesn't make an economic sense to ship it somewhere else to process it further. So basically, as soon as potash comes up, it's processed there. So almost all of the countries, all of the companies worldwide, they sell end product. So in other words, the processing facilities, everything are pretty much in the same location, the same site as the mine itself.
Got it. Okay, that's very helpful. Dustin, I have a few other macro questions, but you want to go ahead and dive in a little bit into the company, and then we can go back out.
Yeah. So in terms of the company, when did you get started with this? And because you've been a part of other ventures as well, what really drew you to this one?
Yeah. So Dustin, this project, it's called Banya Potash Project in Gabon in West Africa. We had known about this project for a few years, but as I mentioned, and you mentioned in the beginning, we had other projects. So we're working on another Millennial. It was called Millennial Lithium. It was a lithium project in Argentina. And once we had sold that project, we started looking for a new project, and we kind of revisited this project in Gabon. And the reason we liked it is twofold. One is the project itself, and two, as I mentioned, the location or the jurisdiction, the country itself. So why we like this project? Because it had already quite a bit of historical exploration data. And that's what we like about all the projects that we'll look at, because we want to make sure that this project has already been explored. Someone has done quite a bit of work. So we don't want to take on a binary seed stage exploration risk of having yes or no answer. So this was one of those projects that had been explored in the past. We could actually digest all that information, and we saw quite a bit of upside potential. And the second thing, the location. Now, location is again, kind of two parts to it. One, the country, jurisdiction, very stable country, very supportive of oil and gas and mining, pretty well-defined permitting environment, legislative framework there. And the second thing, actually, the location of the project itself, which is right on the coast, which makes your logistics a lot easier. So those were the main factors that attracted us. And of course, once we got involved, we started drilling. And the drilling results were a lot better than what we had anticipated. So that was another major thing. So we kind of decided, okay, and the way we approach these projects to minimize or to mitigate our risks, the risk for ourselves, of course, for our shareholders, we always structure what we call earn-in, acquisition, meaning we don't come in and buy the project 100% outright, because then we 100% assume all the risks, so to speak. what we do, we actually agree with the original vendor that we'll do X amount of work, and if certain milestones are hit or achieved, then we'll pay them more cash and we'll issue more shares and so forth. So both sides kind of carry the risk. But if the project is good, in other words, the project actually turns out to be as strong as we had expected, then of course both sides end up making a significant return. So that way we'll mitigate both geological risk, of course, permitting risk and so forth. And that approach has been very successful for us.
And so, in what year did you start Millennial Potash?
So Dustin, we started looking at it in 2022. So it took us about 5-6 months to do our full due diligence. And then in the second quarter of 2023, we took that project into a shell. We did a reverse takeover of one of the Canadian shells, and it became a listed company. And we started drilling in 2023, 2024. And the first results were amazingly good. Just to put it in context and perspective. So we drilled 2 holes in 2024. Potash horizons, potash seams were 70 meters thick. Again, to compare this to major potash deposits in Saskatchewan, in Canada, or in Russia, there, if you get to 20-25 meter thickness, you're very excited about it. It's considered extremely thick. In our case, the first 2 drill holes already intersected 70 meters. Now, last year we drilled more, and we intersected over 100 meters. So in other words, even our 70 meters went up by 40-50%. So again, when you look at almost any other deposit in the world, we think that ours is going to be one of the thickest. And that translates into much lower economics as well.
Quick question on the geology. So these deposits, they're a form of is it a phosphate or is it a potassium?
It's potassium. Yeah, it's potassium. Yeah,
And
potash is potassium.
Is it a sedimentary situation or is it metamorphic situation? How
sedimentary? Yeah, sedimentary. So Daniel, what they're called evaporite basins. So as the name implies, so basically these were ancient seas or trapped seas, if you want to call it, and they evaporate on all kinds of salts actually build at the basin or of this ancient seas. So that's why you see almost always with KCl, which is potash, you always see salt layers as well. So always kind of intertwined or mixed up with them, which is natural. So that's why all these evaporite basins usually have the same structure, meaning they always come with salt, sometimes with magnesium. But the KCl again could be 10 meters thick, could be 3-4 meters thick, could be in our case 70 to 100 meters thick. And so that's how they form.
And is there to keep it in the geology of it, are there purity levels? Is it like 100 meters? It's dense, or does it get diffused? I mean, it's a little bit more on the geology of these.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question, Dan. So the way we measure this in grades. So for example, in our case, we basically measure the whole thing. So we're saying 100 meters, for example, thick potash, but we also measure grade. So in all of that material, so in our case, it's like 15-16% of it is potash. Now in our case, actually, all of that 100 meters is potash. But, we intersect obviously a lot thicker. When we go down, it's almost 300 or so. So out of the whole potash resource, there is a grade. So to give an example, in our case, we got about 6 billion tons, just, based on initial 2 stages of drilling of potash. Out of that 6 billion tons, that's in Canadian mining lingo, it's a measured, indicated, and inferred resource. Measured stands for a higher confidence resource, indicated less confident, and inferred even less. So, but just to put it again, kind of in layman's terms, out of 6 billion tons, 15-16% grade means that out of 6 billion tons, 15% of it is pure potash. So in other words, that's the part that we can actually extract. Obviously, there will be some losses, etc. But let's say, basically, when you say grade, that means that's how much you can actually recover from that.
And that's what you can.
That grade may vary, Daniel, just for clarity. So it may be 10%, maybe 12%, it may be, in our case, 15-16%. It can be all the way up to 30%.
But just for investors, we have a lot of investors that go to rare earth exchanges. So that remaining amount, however, 600 million tons or whatever that comes out to be, it's what you
almost 900 million tons.
900 million tons, sorry. That's what you can project as sales on the market.
Yeah, it's
in the future.
Potentially, correct. Potentially, yes, exactly. So the way the way it will work, obviously, they will do quite a bit of engineering work to see, how much of that 900 million tons in reality you will be able to extract, because there will be
Right.
losses during extraction, there will be losses during processing, there will be losses during recovery and so forth. But generally speaking, you're absolutely right, Daniel. So for instance, I'll give you specific numbers. Last year and a half ago, we did what we call preliminary economic assessment. So we take certain production scenario and look at the costs of that in terms of capital costs and of course operating costs, et cetera. We're looking at 800,000 tons a year operation. And that was on initial resource size. At the time, it was much smaller than 6 billion. And we're already looking at 56 years of mine life. So with the current resource size, we're going to be looking at least 100 years of mine life at much higher production rate. So these projects go on for not only decades, potentially for centuries, depending on your production rate.
Fascinating. Just on economics, what does potash, I'm sure grade may have some impact on price, but what generally is it priced per ton? How is it priced?
Yeah, that's a good question, Daniel. We should probably differentiate that. The grade really doesn't affect your price. So the grade affects your operating costs, your capital costs, and so forth. But the
CapEx,
end product is pretty much the same.
Okay.
So the potash price currently is in a very narrow band. So it's probably between like $340 to about $370 per ton, depending on the region. So the nearest largest market for us, of course, is Africa itself. And it goes for about $360 and $370 per ton right now. The next nearest market for us will be Brazil, which is about $365 per ton. And the U.S. is around $350.
Got it. Okay. That's interesting. So basically, in the life cycle of the development stage, where are you at and how close are you to, production?
Yes, and we're right in the middle. So we just finished, last year we finished our, I would say the core exploration program, which was drilling, of course. We increased our initial resource by almost 300%, which is incredible. And it still covers only 5% of our property. So in other words, we have explored only less than 5% of our property. So the resource there may be humongous, but this is more than enough for us to proceed. So you will see that we'll shortly announce the start of what we call definitive feasibility study. So the feasibility study will cover all the engineering work, all kinds of tests, as well as obviously we'll tighten all our cost estimates. And we expect that to be finished by the end of the year, by probably September of 2026. And while we're doing that, we're also doing environmental social studies. We'll talk about that later on if you guys want to know what exactly we're doing there. So that program should be done by the end of the year as well. And on a parallel track, we will be putting together project financing. You probably know we have U.S. Development Finance Corporation already backing us, so they will be a quite active participant in that. They actually want to be the lead in terms of project financing. So the idea here, Daniel, is to finish all of these programs, bring it to a close by the end of 2026, so that in early 2026 we can have a financial close and start construction. So we're really on the cusp of transition from exploration into the development stage.
Got it. And I think it's a good segue into the environmental piece for this type of mining. What type of mining is it? What kind of permitting and remediation do you have to do? And how is the community working with you and the openness and receptiveness to this endeavor?
Yeah, this is like I'll try to kind of give a good overview of how potash is extracted.
Yeah, high
And
level.
why we chose yeah, exactly. So, and why we actually chose this particular approach. So we're using what they call solution mining method. And so in a nutshell, basically you drill into your ore body, you pump water into your deposit, you dissolve potash underground, you basically pump the brine back up to the surface and you process it there. It is probably the most environmentally friendly and benign approach versus conventional underground operation where you sink a shaft, you go laterally. So it's a lot of work, a lot of cost, and a huge impact on the environment. Now, if you look at potash extraction worldwide, almost 70% of potash today comes through conventional underground operations or production, and the remaining 30% comes through solution mining. Now, we always prefer solution mining, primarily for those two reasons. A, it keeps your cost structure low, and B, it has a minimal environmental impact. We had two potash projects in the past, one in Canada, one in East Africa. They were both amenable to solution mining, so we'll like solution mining. Frankly, our approach to potash is that if it's an underground operation, we won't touch it because we're looking at billions of dollars of capex. You're looking at a tremendous permitting process because it has a huge impact on everything. With solution mining, it's easier. Now, we just started our environmental and social studies. So the environmental and social impact studies. And just to give you an example, how we approach this thing. So a few years back in one of our potash projects, we had International Finance Corporation as an equity holder, as an investor. One of their requirements was that we comply with IFC standards, performance standards, which are basically the highest compliance standards for environmental and social compliance. And since then, frankly, we just stuck with them. Like, for example, the last lithium project, IFC was not an investor, but we stuck with IFC standards because there's a gold standards. And if you basically comply with them, you know that all your due diligence, all the issues, all the permitting will be actually up to the standards, even higher standards than the local standards or the particular country standards. And that's exactly what we're doing in Gabon, Daniel. So if you look at our approach, is basically, at our compliance levels are higher than what is required by Gabon's regulations. But we feel very comfortable with it because I think, that way you eliminate any kind of questions, any kind of issues and so forth. Now, in terms of local engagement, again, we have very good relations with the government. The permitting jurisdiction resides at the federal level, at the central government level. So we deal mostly with the ministry directly. And of course, we have full support from the president and the president's office. But also we work a lot with the local population. Now, we don't have any immediate local population because we're in the middle of, I wouldn't say in the middle of nowhere, but quite 60 kilometers away from people. But we do engage with them all the time so that they know what's going on. We have actually quite a few people, employed from that community in on our side as well. Again, if you go back and look at our track record in all these areas, and we worked in quite remote places, like in Ethiopia, we're literally in the middle of nowhere. The nearest populated town was about 100 kilometers away. In Argentina, we're 5,000 meters above the sea level. But 95% of our workers, or our people, or our staff, were all locals. So, for example, in Ethiopia, at some time, we had 250 people working for us. A half a dozen people were expats. The rest were all Ethiopians. The same thing in Argentina. Canada was different, obviously. All of us are Canadians. Canadians were locals were Canadians. But here in Gabon, exact same thing. We have only 2-3 people who are expats. The rest are all Gabonese.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Dustin, any other thoughts, questions?
Yeah. So just one last question. You talk a lot about how food security is national security. So I would love to get your take really quick on how potash connects to the food supply and national security.
Yeah, Dustin, we've been talking about for a long time. And I'm glad that, as I mentioned, both Canada, US now put potash on their critical minerals list, realizing that potash, as well as some other fertilizers, of course, are directly linked to food security. Right. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we always look at macro trends in the world that will affect certain commodities. And if you look at what's going on in the world right now, and specifically economic trends, there's a lot of deglobalization, a lot of what they call reshoring, onshoring, and so forth. So meaning that a lot of countries are looking at how to secure their own supply of certain things, be it rare earths and other critical minerals. In this case, we're talking about food. Now, before you go and kind of, to war with other people and so forth, you need to feed your people. I always say that, why food security is national security. Look at vast majority of turmoil and, civil unrest in the world. It's not because they have external conflicts. It's because they have economic issues in the country. Like take Venezuela. Way before what happened, a few weeks back, that country was going down because the country's the government just mismanaged the economy. People were having serious issues with food, with, power outages and so forth and so on. So that is the basic thing. And I think a lot of countries have come to that realization that, okay, yes, I'm thinking about the rare earths. I'm thinking about that. Now, rare earths, because China controls it, it's kind of, okay, now we have to make sure we control it too. Before even getting there, before you start making bullets and and artillery pieces and so forth, you have to put food on the table. So that's why I think it's absolutely critical that many countries come to the realization that they have to secure the source of potash, for example, phosphate, etc., because that what goes into your into your soil. And if you look at the situation with soil quality worldwide, it's just getting more and more depleted. Soil quality is getting worse and worse. So you need actually more and more of these fertilizers applied to your soil. So, and again, I'm glad to see that USDFC, US Development Finance Corporation, came in as an early backer of our project, because that actually speaks volumes that, the U.S. government, for the first time, by the way, in the last 30, 40 years, maybe even longer, that is now becoming a serious participant or actor in the mining sector. And potash is directly linked to that food security / national security. And we're so far, we're the only company that USDFC has backed, the only potash company, I think. But going forward, also, we think that it's going to be more prevalent. And hopefully, other governments will join the fray as well. They will come in and support the government and others. And I think we'll see that across the globe. It's not just the U.S. or Canada. If you look at Europe, that's what's happening in Europe. If you look at Gulf countries, the same thing. They take their food security extremely seriously. And of course, it goes without saying that China has been doing for decades. So kind of the Western countries are a little bit of late comers, but still better late than never.
Can you just high level briefly describe the company? So it's publicly traded, right? In the
Yes.
what stock markets?
So it is. Yeah. So Millennial Potash is traded on Toronto Stock Exchange Venture, but we also trade over the counter in the U.S. We also trade over the counter in Frankfurt in Germany. But the main stock exchange is in Canada. Just to give you kind of a brief rundown of who owns what, I mean, we have very strong support from a very large agricultural family office in Singapore, out of Singapore, another family office out of the U.S., out of California, another big group out of the Gulf region. We have quite a few, obviously, funds out of Canada, London, UK also, who own the stock. The management, myself and my colleagues, we own about 20% of the stock as well. And the stock has done quite well. So this is probably the right time for viewers to take a look. I'll put my plug in there. So the stock has been up for almost like 10x in the last 12 to 18 months, primarily because of the drill results. And then eventually USDFC came and supported us. That kind of mitigated the political risk as well.
Well, disclaimer, we're not here to recommend any stock. And we always recommend that people refer to their financial advisors, etc. But we are here to accelerate the both rare earth element and critical mineral supply chains, diversify them. In the case of rare earth outside of China, in the case of critical minerals, we happen to live in the United States. That's our home. So we want more resilience here. We saw what happened with COVID. It's created a lot of chaos and problems. And so that's a big driver for this show and our platform. So, Dustin?
I'm glad you're doing it, Daniel and Dustin, because, again, as we started with this show, very few people, especially in the U.S., know about mining in general, as you probably know, of course. But this is the time now to bring them up to speed. And this is a time not only for the U.S. government, but also U.S. financial institutions, as well as retail investors to understand the importance. Because I remember, this is going to sound like a little joke, but many, many years ago, we had a uranium company in Canada, but it was also dual listed in New York, and we had a lot of projects in the States. And I remember it was so difficult to find uranium geologists, Daniel, in the U.S. We had a running joke. We said that there are two types of uranium geologists in the U.S. Either they're octogenarians or they're dead. I'm sorry to say that, but the reason for that was that, the schools, universities decided that mining was dead. There's no need to train new geologists. There's no need to train mining engineers. And I think that's a mindset that we should really step away from. Luckily, in Canada, Australia, they continued with it. In other words, they did not. But in the U.S., it's a high time that they realize that, they should introduce a lot of these programs.
We've been cranking out influencers. So we're gonna focus on more, rudimentary, back to basics,
exactly.
Like mining, like engineering. That's where we need to go. So we're honored to have you and to be part of this process. What you're doing is incredibly important, Dustin.
Yes, likewise.
Thank you, Daniel.
I'll just say, for those who are listening to this show and have found it educational as much as we have, please give it a thumbs up wherever you are listening to this podcast. And if you don't want to miss a future show, please subscribe. Farhad, thank you so much for your wealth of knowledge and educating us and our audience about potash and its massive impact on the economy, kind of that hidden impact there. So we wish you the best of luck, and hopefully sometime in the future we'll get you back on the show to get an update on where your project is at.
Thank you so much, Dustin. Thanks a lot, Dan. It was a pleasure.
Likewise.
And yes, I'll be happy to give an update in a few months or so.
Absolutely. Thanks,
Thanks
guys.
a lot, guys. Take care.